Well, good morning to you all. We've come once again here to Easter morning. This is 2024, and I'm happy to stand with the church throughout the ages and proclaim the great call and response that we've already heard. Christ is risen. The Lord is risen indeed. This is one of the very first, we could try that again, I guess. You're right. So, hallelujah. Christ is risen. Hallelujah. That's right. Actually, in the Greek, Christos anesti, aletheos anesti. This is one of the earliest call and responses of Christian people, and many scholars consider it actually coming from our gospel reading today, where the angel says, "He is not here, he is risen." Christos anesti, aletheos anesti. Christ is risen. The Lord is risen indeed. So here we are, some 2,000 plus years later, proclaiming essentially the same sermon that has been preached year after year after year, beginning with that first statement from the angel, "He is not here, he is risen." Now, in preparation for this sermon, although Easter sermons have a certain shape to them, it's difficult to mess up, although we'll talk about how people in fact do. Nevertheless, I did go back and check over my sermon from last year just to make sure that I wasn't repeating myself too much. I wanted to read it, and I was actually reminded, and we just sort of got lost in the timing, that it was this Sunday last year where we were 3 days, Liza and I, from leaving here and going to Kigali, Rwanda, to be part of a global Anglican meeting called GAFCON there in Kigali. And so part of the sermon that I preached last year was a little bit of thanks and gratitude for the time that we had been given. It was 9 months. We had been 9 months in as your rector, but also the support that you were showing me and allowing me to go for the next 10 days to be a part of this gathering. But I was also reflecting on the fact that it was quite an unusual experience for me, not the least of which having never gone to Africa, but precisely because I had grown up in a church that was not unlike this one that was invested in mission and evangelism and actually wanted to send people to the corners of the earth so that they would hear the gospel and be saved. And so I grew up in a church like this, and so periodically, as does happen here, people would come back from the mission field and they would say, "This is what we've been doing. This is how many people have made a decision for Christ. These are people that have heard the gospel. This is a church that we built," and we were very encouraged to hear what had been going on in the world from the people that we had sent. Well, if you had told me as a young child that I would be going to Africa not unlike those missionaries had come to us, that I would be the one who was going there to find encouragement, to seek inspiration, to actually look around and see what was being done, and then in order to come back here to the mission field that the Lord had called us to here in what we now call the West. I would not have believed you. And yet that's precisely what happened. Being there and a handful of sort of Western people around all of the people in the various tribes and languages and people of the world from all corners singing, praising, and worshiping God together was a foretaste of the heavenly banquet. And it certainly did inspire and redoubled our energy, mine and Liza's, to come back here and redouble our efforts here at St. Luke's here on Hilton Head. Not because we're afraid that this church will somehow die, but Jesus didn't promise, that being said, that any denomination would not prevail against the gates of hell, or that any particular church. He said that his church, the blessed company of all faithful people, would persevere. But we came back redoubled in our efforts, not for job security exactly, but because of the confusion and the desperation and the urgency that we see all around us. You see, in Romans 4, the Apostle Paul writes that the wages of sin is death, and at the heart of sin is unbelief. And I see the wages of unbelief in the lives of living death all around me. It's a heavy Easter sermon, I know. But this Easter is not about bunnies and springtime and seersucker, although those are all great things. But Easter is about a cosmic victory over sin and death that lies at the very heart of reality. It's no small thing. That's why we pull out all the stops, because this is what Easter is about. You see, you need to ignore what you have been told. Despite what you have been told, your life is actually a weighty endeavor. There are real questions that you will have to face, genuine challenges that you will have to overcome, and the decisions that you make will have consequences, and those decisions will be based upon a prior set of beliefs. And if you don't believe in anything very much, well, then you're in for a rough ride. Of course, I don't have to tell many, if not all of you, this. And in one sense, it's not a particularly profound statement, because until yesterday, at least, when it came to our cultural and intellectual leaders, the mark of sophistication, and in fact, leadership, the mantle of leadership, was only bestowed upon people who actually considered the great truths of life, people that considered what the good, the true, and beautiful were. These were the people that sort of led us in other words, the people who had a deep consideration about the nature of human existence in light of the fact that life is weighty, serious, and real. But paraphrasing Thomas Jefferson, quote, "We get the leaders we deserve." And across the spectrum, in almost every imaginable field, from the political to the church to the cultural, in all across the spectrum, we are living with deeply unserious leadership. And as the saying goes, a fish rots from the head. Well, why do I say that? Well, in part because the prevailing attitude, and this is particularly sad within the church, seems to be a wholesale rejection of anything understood to be objectively true, anything that is considered to be universally binding across all peoples and all times. You may have heard people default to the, quote, "my truth," or as you heard last Palm Sunday, like Pilate in an exasperated cynicism, simply say, well, what is truth? How could we really know? Who could possibly be sure? And the tragedy of this is that life cannot be lived in any meaningful, lasting, or resilient way without a commitment to something greater than oneself, without a sense of the transcendent, and without something of a purpose, a plan, and a hope. But despite this, people have tried this to lead and guide and educate people in just this cynical way for decades, if not centuries. And not only does it not work, you and I get to live in the time where we get to see the rot exposed. We get to see it turn septic to sour. But on the flip side of that, we also get to see people starting to look for something, anything that will ground them, that will give them a sense of purpose, that will help them hold up the weight of their crumbling lives. Now, I was reminded of this just yesterday. I was scrolling, very Holy Saturday Twitter scrolling yesterday, very pious, and I ran across a headline that was pretty straightforward. And it was lamenting the fact that many people who live in the, quote, West, the people that have the patrimony of Christendom, many people living in these countries are lamenting the fact that a lot of the good things that came along with the Christian worldview, for lack of a better word, are falling away. And there are many people lamenting this. Things like the rule of law, things like due process, inalienable rights, monogamy, public decency, chastity, modesty, etc. There are many people who are loudly being upset about the decline of these things, and yet they aren't in church even today. The title of the article was, "Britain Will Not Be a, quote, Christian Country Without Christians." And of course, you could substitute Britain with any of the other countries of the West and see a similar occurrence happening. The key paragraph reads this: "True, Christianity remains and should remain the, quote, traditional faith of Britain," but he continues, "but traditions will not endure if they're only recognized as traditions. Traditions will not endure if they are only recognized as traditions. ornaments we keep around for old time's sake until we die and our successors casually throw them away. So buried deep in that article, was an allusion to a poem by an English poet named Philip Larkin. I was briefly aware of him, but I was not aware of this 1954 poem called Church Going. Now, I won't read the entire poem here today, but suffice it to say, in 1954, Philip Larkin was writing a poem about the fact that the English countryside, as you may know, is dotted with all sorts of beautiful old stone churches, that each and every village had its own stone church, and many of them lie, even in 1954, in disrepair and lay vacant, or at least mostly empty, perhaps even on Easter. And so this poem, Church Going, one of the stanzas says this: a shape less recognizable each week, a purpose more obscure. I wonder who will be the last, the very last, to seek this place for what it was. So as often the case with good poems, the concluding stanza caught me really off guard, and it struck a chord deep in my soul. So after spending most of the poem lamenting and wondering about the fate of these old buildings, how they will exist, quote, after belief has died, we read this: a serious house on serious earth it is, in whose blent air all our compulsions meet, are recognized and robed as destinies, and that much never can be obsolete, since someone will forever be surprising a hunger in himself to be more serious, and gravitating with it to this ground, which he once heard was proper to grow wise in, if only that so many dead lie round. I love that haunting at the end, the dead lie around. You can walk, if you come in this way, past our columbarium, past the dead who have gone ahead of you, as you surely will, just as you do around countryside churches all over the world, through death into life. This is the mark of these countryside churches. A serious house on a serious earth it is. Well, our world at this moment lacks this seriousness. But the resurrection brought this serious grounding to the world. And this is the purpose and work of the church: to preach this gospel, to watch people get saved, to ground them, secure them, and hold them fast in and throughout the wind and waves of life, which most surely will come. Now, despite, as I said before, what our culture wants to tell you, you are, in fact, a serious person. Your life has weight and value and eternal significance. You can run from that. You can try to ignore it. You can try to convince yourself that nothing is actually true, that guilt and shame are just psychological problems to be medicated, and that death is not to be feared. You can try this, but you'll fail. You can tell yourself that until the diagnosis comes or the tests come back positive. You can tell yourself that nothing really matters until you look into the face of your first child. Life will get serious at some point. And when it does, and this is the most tragic part, when it gets serious, then the time for preparing is past. And you will be left exposed with what you actually believe. This is why, at the heart of any Easter sermon, at the conclusion of all our Holy Week observances and services, just like for the early disciples and apostles, the first, and in many ways the only question about Easter is simply this: is it true? Did he walk out of that grave? Is he raised? Is he coming back? Because if it's true, then in a certain sense, nothing else matters, although everything is colored by it. If it's not true, well, then you need to find something that is, because without something upon which you can stand, then your life will not be able to bear the weight of your life. You see, this is the sad part. People in the church have tried to domesticate this argument of the Bible, as fantastic as it is. They have tried to domesticate this early Christian proclamation And yet, it's the only thing that matters. I mean, the most insidious to me is when people try to skirt the issue by preaching about, quote, resurrection life. And they try to say something like, God is in the business of renewal. Look at the springtime. We celebrate resurrection, always begging the question, which resurrection? Whose resurrection? Do you mean the resurrection? Because if we're not talking about that, we're not talking about the same thing. Some people have tried to argue that this was an experience of the divine, that the disciples, so distraught, were nevertheless overcome by a sense of the divinity with them, and that's what they were talking about when they preached about Jesus. Some people argue that his body was stolen, but that would have been very easy for the Jews or Romans to simply bring the body forth as they continued to preach this seemingly ridiculous message about this risen Messiah. And again, it's hard to believe that each of the disciples took this exact same lie with them to the grave, enduring hardships, beating, and ultimately martyrdom, not fame and fortune, for a lie. Again, during my pious Holy Saturday scrolling yesterday, I ran across a quote attributed to Chuck Colson along these lines. Some of you may know Chuck Colson was part of the Watergate scandal. He was sent to prison, and in prison he became a Christian, emerged from prison very much a sort of evangelist, apologist, and teacher. And so he has this quote about the resurrection and the apostles. He says this, excuse me, I know the resurrection is a fact, and Watergate proved it to me. How? Because 12 men testified they had seen Jesus raised from the dead. Then they proclaimed that truth for 40 years, never once denying it. Everyone was beaten, tortured, stoned, and put in prison. They would not have endured that if it weren't true. Watergate embroiled 12 of the most powerful men in the world. They couldn't keep a lie for 3 weeks. That's what he says, you're telling me 12 apostles could keep alive for 40 years? Absolutely impossible. One of my favorite explanations, or I shouldn't say his favorite, one of the saddest explanations for the empty tomb is that the Romans somehow did not succeed in actually killing Jesus. And so, in his wounded state, he rolls away the massive stone, defeats the centurions by himself, and then presents himself as the victorious Lord over death to his disciples. And you say, well, that begs the all sorts of plausibility. Nevertheless, this is an attempt that people make. These are the attempts that people have tried to give, and they all fail. They all fail because that's not the argument. That was never the sermon. That's not what the church has been founded on. That's not what was preached by the apostles. That's not ultimately even very interesting, that in Jesus you might be able to find a particular expression of the divine or even a unique experience of the transcendent. You see, we're separated from the early disciples by time and culture, to be sure. But the event of Jesus' resurrection was just as shocking to them as it is to us today. The sermon back then should be just as clear and precise. As we heard from Peter today, he says this, are we witnesses of all that he did, both in the country of the Jews and in Jerusalem? They put him to death by hanging him on a tree, but God raised him on the third day and made him to appear, not to all the people, but to us who have been chosen by God as witnesses, who ate and drank with him after he rose from the dead. And he commanded us to preach to the people and to testify that he is the one appointed by God to be the judge of the living and the dead. To him all prophets bear witness that everyone who believes in him receives forgiveness of sins through his name. That is the message that changed the world. That is the gospel that, when preached in the power of the Spirit, brings life to the unbelieving dead. First, the early converts, then their families, churches, towns, cities, and ultimately nations themselves were influenced by this new reality, the unveiling of the real truth about life and death and God. This was the final fulfilling of the prophecy Isaiah had about the veil that hangs over all people. The shroud of death would finally be removed, and life would be found in Jesus' name. Now, I love the C.S. Lewis quote from The Weight of Glory, and I went back and checked, and I'm pretty sure I've used this in every Easter sermon that I've ever preached. So there we go. I wanted to stay consistent for you. But it's from The Weight of Glory, and he says this: I believe in Christianity as I believe that the sun has risen, not only because I see it, but because by it I see everything else. Not because I see it, but because by it I see everything else. You see, this becomes clear in the reading of the New Testament, that by the death and resurrection of Jesus, everything was finally put into place. And here's the key to this. It is precisely at the great uncertainties of life, it's precisely those conflict points that vex and confuse people, those became the platforms from which the gospel was preached. The very points of contention, those very things that keep you up at night, these are the things that are now illuminated by the resurrection of Jesus. We are no longer adrift, no longer confused, no longer lost in a world without purpose, meaning, or hope. Where did you come from? Question rings out. Why are you here? What's wrong with you? Where can you find help? Why are there sicknesses, disease, and death? What's on the other side? All of these questions become the platform from which preachers now proclaim the resurrected Christ for the world. You see, these questions eat at people. And because of sin, we try to answer them in all sorts of destructive ways. And the saddest part of all is that the very things that are intended to be gifts for us, things like life itself, things like love, family, work, pleasure, sport, you name it, all of these good things of God, in light of unbelief, in light of his absence, become those areas that are the most confusing, the most painful, and the most conflicted. Now you'll say, well, you don't know my life. I have a pretty good life. I've done some things, haven't done some things. And you're right, I don't know each and every one of you. Certainly even the ones I do know well, there's more to be known, and so there's some truth in that. But I am a pastor. I've spent a lot of time with people in very difficult and very joyful times of their lives. And I've seen the terror in people's eyes when they face death. I've seen the hopeless despair of fathers who don't really know why in that church that they were dragged to, they promised to, quote, forsake all others as long as they live. I've seen mothers who resent the physical sacrifice of childbearing. I've seen people destroyed by the lie of casual sex, the pain, the agony, and heartache of people having to live in a world where they are forced to make their own meaning, where they are chained to finding their own purpose and identity, and all the while walking the inexorable march of time towards their own certain yet uncertain future. But I've also seen heroic acts of self-sacrifice and service. I have walked with people who are immensely peaceful and even joyful in the face of death. I've seen joyful and abiding relationships between husbands and wives. I've seen reconciliation between parents and children and friends. I've seen all of these things in light of the resurrected Christ in the lives of his people. Of course, there are better and worse days for us all, Christian and non. But the foundation of Christ's church holds. You can build your life upon it because it's trustworthy. He is trustworthy. He is faithful, and he is good. This much we know. Christ has died. Christ is risen. And Christ will come again. And that changes everything. So this Easter morning, either for the first time or anew or afresh or in whatever capacity, let Jesus be your anchor. Feed once again on his body and blood. Read, mark, learn, and inwardly digest his holy word. fellowship with the saints of God in his body, the church, and rest. Find your peace with Christian people today and down through the ages in that truth that illuminates all other claims, the proclamation of the angel and the early apostles that continues to echo in the hearts of all faithful people. Brothers and sisters, alleluia! Christ is risen. The Lord is risen indeed. Alleluia.